So Amber and Richard, we were just actually chatting before we sat down here about what focus we wanted to do with this panel, because basically the Maine Grain Alliance covers so many different parts of the production process. Every link is kind of represented there, from getting the seed into the ground to milling to bakers and brewers, even to a pretty great example of public outreach with the Kneading Festival and the Kneading Conference and the artisan bread fair. So one of the words that came up when we were chatting was just staying nimble, and what that meant for them, and how that might be able to apply to the Quebec scene. So Amber's going to start, and we're going to try to cover some of the, maybe do a little compare and contrast between Maine and Quebec as we move along, but also just to hit those key parts of the Alliance. So I'm going to let, Amber begin by kind of setting the scene in Skowhegan, Maine.
Great, thank you so much. As quickly as I can and as succinctly as I can, I'm going to just give you the background on how we come to be working on grains in Maine. I don't have a background in grains at all, but I moved to my town of Central Maine in 2001, which had fallen on hard times. We were a milling community that specialized in making shoes and wood products in our area. Mark is wearing New Balance shoes, which are still made in Skowhegan, but that is one of the last remaining industries in our hometown. And so our town had undertaken an effort to revitalize its downtown, which required the involvement of the business community, the town body, and citizens in the community to reimagine our future. And at that time, that was 2005, I joined as a volunteer and a new mom, trying to figure out where I could plug in. And I plugged in helping our farmers market of 3 people grow into something much bigger, as a way to create vibrancy, but also create markets for local food, which was something that I cared about. And this whole revitalization approach that our community adopted, which is a nationally recognized approach called the Main Street Program, really started with starting conversations about what our assets are in the community. And some of you know of a world-class oven builder that is from Skowhegan, Albie Barden, builds masonry heaters and wood-fired bake ovens for bakers. And he is one of the businesses that is unique. They are importers of a French Le Pagnol style wood-fired oven for bakers. And Albie came to me one day and said, he was trying to pull together bakers, oven builders, millers, anybody who knew something about local grains to start these conversations about why don't we have local grains in our communities for bakers, and why are grains missing from conversations about local food? So if you remember, about 10, 12 years ago, locavore diets were starting, these 100-mile challenges, can you eat within 100 miles of where you live? And grains kept getting listed as a wild card with olive oil and black pepper and things like that that you couldn't be expected to get from your own local community. And so that had some of us just scratching our heads who cared about the local food scene in our community, and I'm trying to figure it out. So anyway, kind of marry this sort of desire to revitalize our community of Skowhegan, which is about 8,000 people, just for reference, and take Albie's unique talents in wood-fired oven building, and there were some statewide frameworks promoting economic development by way of looking at clusters. A lot of talk about how to build out clusters in order to create jobs. The state of Maine was really focused on tech clusters and marine clusters, but when Albie showed up at my door one day and said, I'd really like to start this conference that involves oven builders and bakers and millers, I thought, oh, that's a cluster. The state will care about this at some point. Let's start talking. So in 2007, we formed the Kneading Conference, KNEAD, and there's a lot of familiar faces out there that have been to the event. It has been held continuously ever since in Skowhegan, and it involves a 2-day intensive conference with hands-on bread baking workshops, discussions about revival of local grains in our communities, and it's wrapped up by a 3rd-day artisan bread fair that invites surrounding communities in. We kind of throw the doors open and we do demos and sell bread and whatnot. So in any event, that project, which started as volunteer work for me, turned into a full-fledged nonprofit organization as we evolved because there were more questions. You know, the first event raised more questions and we needed more answers. And so we kept hosting more events and more workshops. And we started getting called on to do outreach to schools. And we grant funded a mobile wood-fired oven to do baking out and about in the world. And so the more we were asked to do, the more we realized we really needed to stay focused on how are we defining our work? What do we want to accomplish? How far are we going to reach with our message and our activities? And Rachel will talk a little bit about the heritage seed work we're doing, but we've basically honed in on some pinch points in the local grain economy that need addressing, and we've remained nimble by remaining somewhat unaffiliated. So we've worked hard to incorporate members of our board that are from the university culture or from the business communities, or making sure that we have baker representation and brewer representation on our board of directors. But we're unaffiliated in our funding. So we worked hard to create programs that generated funding that could fuel our work and that were less reliant upon corporate sponsorships or grant writing. We're strategic about writing grants when we want to develop a new program or start a new program that might help launch us or might help buy a critical piece of equipment in order to take next steps. But we've remained fairly nimble, and there's a lot of power in that is kind of one of the messages I want to start with here today. There's a lot of power in remaining nimble because we can identify, for example, in our own community, we've got incredible plant breeders and seed savers that are very, very small scale, that have done the work of traveling the world to collect from seed banks and who have done the work of researching what plants used to grow in our area, but hadn't yet done the work of exponentially increasing the supply of seed to make a variety commercially viable again. So we were able to grant fund a project that launched a heritage seed restoration project that would do the exponential increasing work with seeds we already had in hand and wanted more of in order to get them in the hands of bakers. So in any event, I'm going to pause here for a second and let Richard say a few words. But in essence, what we've created in Maine is a nonprofit organization that has the Kneading Conference and Bread Fair, a year-round baking education program, a heritage seed restoration project, and we're also able to give technical assistance grants of $250 to $1,000 to grain-based businesses in Maine to keep fueling their efforts. So it's not much money, but sometimes a bakery or a farm or a mill just needs the auger that makes this process more efficient, or the mixer that allows them to scale up, or help buying the new oven that allows them to scale up. And so we now give away small grants for that work. So we run a nonprofit organization as a result of these discoveries in Maine and the missing infrastructure that made grains possible in our region. I have since started a mill with a business partner in our downtown. We actually repurposed an old Victorian jailhouse in our downtown. Please come to Skowhegan, I'll give you a tour. But essentially this jailhouse was 4 stories tall and an overbuilt, very sturdy building, as you can imagine. So it actually works well for a mill. We send grain to the very top. We gravity feed through 3 floors of equipment that focuses on the cleaning, dehulling, separation technologies that make grains food grade, and then we mill and distribute freshly milled flour throughout the Northeast. So I'm going to pause there, and there'll be plenty more to talk about, I'm sure.
So I'm Richard Roberts, and I got involved through Amber just out of curiosity about this mill that was starting up. I went, what the heck is this going on in Skowhegan? So I went down and volunteered, and I was painting trim inside the mill, and that's how I met Amber. So through that, I was just a back to the lander and a gardener and a carpenter and a mechanic. And then in my middle ages, around 40, I stumbled on to the local school district, and lo and behold, I'm running their alternative program and became an English teacher. So I retired from that. When I turned 62, I said, okay, I'm getting the hell out of this before I go crazy, and got involved, met Amber, got involved in this grain thing. So this really intrigued me. I was fascinated by the idea that there used to be this huge grain economy in Maine, and it had disappeared. What happened to it? You know, as I think so, like so many other things, Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, that was the breadbasket of the American colonies. And they got put out of business by the Erie Canal. So the Erie Canal opened up the American West, which was the land around Rochester, Buffalo, Erie. That's all grapevines now, but that was all wheat fields then. So what put New England out of business? Transportation costs. So they were able to get grain down to the market much cheaper because they went on the ferry. So then we got this grant going up there about people were going to try to grow out some of these little handfuls of grain that we had. And we'd gotten grain, some from a woman named Ellie Ragosa, some from other people, little just handfuls of things. And we divided it up among people and started growing out in 4 different places. And then that just grew and grew. We started out at that time with a variety of wheat that came from Estonia to Maine in 1998 to a seed saver. He had managed to put together 14 pounds of it, so we got 14 pounds in 2013, and now there are 30 acres of it growing right in central Maine. So that's what was one of the talks about how long things take to get going. So there was from 2013, 14 pounds to 2018 last year, planted 30 acres. So, and of course that was a lot of failures in some places too. You know, I would always be looking for people who were willing to let me use some land. Gardeners just say, well, I can let you have this little section right here, and I would have gathered up enough from a handful to the next year to maybe a few pounds, and then I could grow an area this big. And then I would have a farmer that would say, I can give you a 1/4 of an acre, but I don't know how I'm going to plant it over there because I've got a 10-foot seed drill. So we ended up purchasing a little 6-row seed drill that I can stick on the back of my pickup truck and take over somewhere, and they'll plant it. So slowly over time, I meet seed savers. I go and speak at every garden club I can find, any place that is willing to have me, I'll talk. And usually at one of those places, somebody will say, oh, I'm interested in doing that. How can I help doing this? I give seed away to people. I get seed from people. Once they hear that you're open and available to doing it, there's this incredible fascination and worry that we're losing our seed diversity. Amber and I went last year to this international conference in Bologna, Italy on landrace seeds. What's happening right here in this room is happening all around the world. And it's these little local communities that are going, what the heck is going on? We used to have all this different stuff going around here, but now all that's going on is what I refer to as agricultural imperialism. You know, that's like just these certain varieties are being taken over everywhere because they're very profitable and they're easy to grow. So we're losing that diversity. And it's not just here, it's everywhere in the world. It's in the Levant where grain came from. They're desperately trying to save and hang on to those einkorns and those emmers and those things in the country of Georgia, Azerbaijan, Israel. I met a guy from Israel, and he was telling me that after the Second World War, when the refugees came in, none of them wanted the flour that from the grain that was growing there because it didn't rise. It was just flatbread. So they brought in their grains from where they lived, and that pushed these native grains out. And so now there are people trying to hang on to those things. So that's what we're doing there in Maine. I'm always trying to find varieties of grain that will grow in our climate. I think if I tried to bring something from North Dakota back into Maine, it just wouldn't really survive in our wet summers. So I'm focusing primarily on things from Northern Europe. So I get things from seed savers. I meet someone somewhere. They ship me some seeds. I try growing them. One of the things I've learned is that a winter grain in Italy is not the same as a winter grain in Maine. that you may plant something in September and it comes up and looks real nice, but where did it go in the spring when the snow went away? It's just completely vanished. So what I'm doing is taking some of those varieties and saving them and trying to plant them in the spring. And I'm finding they do okay. How long will they, can I have a season long enough to last to be able to get a good product out of it? Well, I'll have to find out. But I think that's one of the advantages of kind of doing it the way we are. We're not affiliated with a university or anybody that has like a cycle that they go, okay, we can work on this project for 3 or 4 years, and then we have a new graduate student that's coming in and is going to take over, you know. So we can do these kind of long-term ideas, and we're just doing it on a shoestring, trying to get money from here and there, get a little grant going something, you know, doing something, and keeping it going that way.
I'll just piggyback on that for a second, just to say, the question came up earlier, how quickly can you commercialize a variety? It's about a 10-fold exponential increase per year is our general rule of thumb and what we're finding. And you know, we were talking on the ride here about the quote, if you heard the quote, the revolution will not be funded. We were saying the revolution will not always be funded. Sometimes we find funding for the work we're doing, and sometimes you just find the people that really, really care about the work you're doing who are going to keep it going with or without being paid. We were fortunate to find philanthropic organizations that see the benefit in what we're doing. So in the early years, we paid farmers to engage in this. We don't want to ask too much of their time that's not compensated. We know it's valuable. So we've actually had pots of money to pay farmers to help us with this. Sometimes we don't, and some have just continued with it. But I would say, to reiterate Richard's point, our first conference was 80 people. It's grown over the years to be a steady 250 attendees at the conference with over 3,000 that come to the bread fair. Our keynote speaker this year will be from Nottingham, England. She is a baker who works hand in hand with Martin Wolf, the wheat researcher who's in his 80s, who's been working on climate change and adaptability of grains. So where he plants basically windrows of grain in between forested rows of mixed varieties. He harvests for what does well in a particular year, and then he passes it on to Kimberly at the bakery to figure out what it will do well in. So there's a really symbiotic relationship there to work with really resilient varieties, and I think that's an interesting model. It came up earlier today, and it will be the focus of this year's conference. The other thing I want to say that should just give you hope is you know, this conference we went to in Italy last year, just realizing that these conversations are happening everywhere, and these different pockets are at varying stages of solving their pinch points, whether it's infrastructure or knowledge or seed varietals or whatever it is, that we're all at various stages, but it's a really small world. And one of the things that gave me a lot of confidence to switch up what I was doing in my life and dedicate my time and energies to grain is just that I ended up in an introductory course to wheat milling at Kansas State University as a way to just try to figure out, if I'm going to enter the world of milling, what do I need to know? And there's only 2 places in the world to formally learn milling. You can go to K-State or you can go to Switzerland somewhere, and Kansas was accessible. I went for a week. The class was only 12 people. Those 12, I was the only female in the class, and among those 12, there were grain traders trying to learn about grain just to trade on the marketplace. There was a guy from India trying to solve his rice dehulling issues. There were mill managers from the Midwest trying to learn their trade better. But in the context of that class, recognizing that this is one of 2 places in the world to learn this, the only focus of the class and the institution is white flour production. Nobody on faculty at Kansas State University could point me in the direction of a single book in their library on stone milling. Less than 0.1% of the grain being grown in the country at that time, that was 2008, was organic. Less than 0.1% is organic. Right now, it's less than 0.5%, so it's increasing a little bit, but not much. And you know, I ended up seeing the demonstration mill there, which was a 5-story concrete cinder block building. I knew this jail in my hometown was for sale. And I came home saying, okay, if no one there knows about this, then I'm not going to learn it. I'm not going to learn it formally anywhere else, and neither is anyone else, right? So we should all feel good about this kind of information sharing. This is exactly where change is happening, and it's exactly where you're going to learn the things you need to know. It set me on a path to learn stone milling by going to places like Denmark. This was slightly before Blair and Andrew were building mills, so we ended up buying our mill from Austria and took some trips over there to learn from mills that were about 10 years ahead of us. So.
No, that's great. And I was just thinking, now it has been about 10 years. So when you're looking back, where do you think you are now? A lot of us are at earlier stages. You're saying this conversation's happening all over the world in different ways. Sort of, to what extent do you feel your model is transposable to other places? And are you learning, what are you taking away from other places that you visit?
I still really love the clusters framework, because if you think about grain as a cluster, we need farmers, we need researchers, we need labs that can evaluate, we need people with knowledge, people who are going to do the farming, figure out the milling, do the baking, and then within that, keep imagining all the other services. So brewers in Maine are the newest to enter this cluster en masse, because we have about 150 craft breweries in Maine now that are starting to figure out that their primary ingredient could also be a local product. So whether it's malted grains or raw grains, they're entering the fold. It has created opportunities for 2 new malting businesses in Maine that are small scale, right down to who else is in the cluster that we're not even imagining. So we, as a mill, we're developing an ecosystem around our mill where even the byproducts are useful to the community. So we have a wait list now for our feed grade byproducts, things, shrunken and broken kernels that we pull off of grain. Livestock producers in our immediate community want that stuff. Amish farmers are moving up from Pennsylvania to access some of our affordable open farmland. They're discovering these byproducts as hugely helpful on the farm to bring feed costs down. We sell oat hulls that we take off of oats to mushroom companies that use that as a medium for propagating mushrooms commercially. We also sell the oat hulls to an organic compost facility in a nearby community who displaces vermiculite in his potting soil with oat hulls now because they're so rich in microbes that, and they lighten the soil, so he's creating commercialized products that way. So it will go on and on. We're just starting to discover the benefits of restoring the ecosystem around grains. I didn't mention that one of the key reasons why we were able to kind of jump into a grain discussion in Maine had to do not with growing grains for food and beer, but the university was trying to figure out the economic viability of growing grains for organic dairy farmers, of which Maine has a lot, because inputs like straw, organic straw, were getting too expensive to bring in from outside the state to put in barns in order to meet organic specs for organic dairy operations. So they were retraining organic dairies how to grow grains for those kinds of inputs. So it is a system of which there are lots of benefits and needs met.
Yeah, and all of you, so we've got bakers and millers and brewers and growers, and what do they all have in common is grain. So they all have something, you all have something that you care about here, and there's the focus, and you can expand out into all these different people who will support you in different ways. The brewers, they year before last, when there were just still less than 100, they used the equivalent of 15,000 acres of grain in the brewing industry, and they could only get 5,000 acres in the state. So there is the potential for a market, but it's convincing the farmer to take that chance, and that's the big thing. I've had farmers tell me, I'll grow anything you want. You give me a contract, I'll grow it. But it's just trying to get that over that hump and convincing people. So I've been going to every place I could to listen to barley growers. What are the problems are they having? So I can go and talk to farmers, because there are old, like dairy farms kind of going out, younger people that are coming in. And then the other thing is small scale equipment. You know, we've got to, we don't have really a lot of really big fields in Maine. So you go back and you look, what kind of equipment did they used to use there? And it's those old 60s, tow behind tractors and small scale combines. Where can you get that stuff today? You really can't. It's just gotten bigger and bigger. So it's like we almost need to kind of really work on turning it in some ways back around and realize that we kind of, in a way, have to kind of go back to our roots. That this really big stuff isn't going to go for the kind of things that we would like to be able to have, which is healthy soil, healthy food, and healthy communities.
So I guess it is an infrastructure question, right? If you don't have, you need to get that seed into the ground, you need to have somewhere to store it, you need to have a mill to, be able to mill it, then you need to be able to get it out. So it's a whole sort of network along the way, obviously. I'm also curious about corn, because we talked a bit about corn today, and where is Maine at in terms of corn?
One of the things we tried to do with the seed restoration project was work on restoring flint corn, Native American flint corns. And we have one of the members of our group, Albie, is he's incredibly passionate about corn. So we've tried to do what we can to support him. In fact, he just had a few weeks ago something called a cornference there at his barn, and it was like 75 people showed up who all they were all interested in how can they be involved in growing flint corn. And of course, as you know, growing corn, you can't just grow, you grow wheat, you can grow one variety here, you can grow another variety there, and you can grow another variety there, and the chances are pretty slim that you're going to come up with something different. They're not going to cross. But corn, you can't do it. So you've got to find people that are willing to grow some corn in a place that's not near some other place. And of course, one of the things that growing corn in Maine does is it draws every raccoon from a 25-mile radius around there, It's like talking about a baseball no-hitter. You never say, I think the corn's ready to harvest tomorrow. Because if you do, all these little raccoon ears go up all around the place, and off they come there, So there's one of the other problems with restoring all these things. Corn is really difficult because everything likes to eat it. The grain is tough because you grow it, and one year it may have done really great, and what it's like being a farmer is you're at the whims of nature. And it may do great this year, and next year it's different. It's like what Blair was saying about the quality of the wheat that she gets. It was wonderful this year, but boy, the year before that, so you have to relearn all the time what you're doing with it, just as a farmer has to relearn all the time, what's happening now. Are you planting? Did you get things planted in the ground? It's still so soggy in Maine. I can go walk out in front of my house and walk and step in mud up to up over the tops of my ankles. So I have places that are dry that I've got something growing, but other places I can't plant anything. So it's always that stuff. One of the other things that we talked about too was our ability to have give out these small scale grants. Because we're a nonprofit, there are people, wealthy individuals and corporations who like the idea, would like to be able to support it somehow, but they don't want to be able to, they can't go through that whole rigmarole of grants writing and coming to the interviews and everything like that. So they'll give us some money and say, here, we want to try to support small scale grain growing in Maine. So here's some money for you to do it. And so then we will just announce that, okay, by we need some proposals in by June 15th. And, we get a number of proposals in, and then we can get a committee right together there easily together, look them over, and be able to give these small scale grants out to people. So we're able, because we're a small group, we can get together and make those decisions quickly rather than go through some 6-month, and you have to write 500 words on 17 questions.
I was just going to add, infrastructure has been a major thing we've focused on, and different regions are going to have different strengths. But In Maine, in 2007, there was no dehulling capacity, so no machines in the state that could take the hull off of oats or spelt or emmer or einkorn to make them commercially available for food. We lacked machinery that would take vetch out of grain seed. So we realized when we started the mill, it would be critical for us to set up cleaning capacity in our mill. Not all mills do that. Some mills build themselves to take mill-ready grain, which requires that it be cleaned elsewhere. And so there are other regions and up in Canada where there are cleaning facilities where if your farm, you could take it there, get it mill-ready, and then just send it to a mill. So in these pockets of activity across the country and world, you'll see different levels of infrastructure at the mill, on the farm. But for us, it was critical that we get that set up so we could start moving grain into the marketplace. Now we're focused on helping farmers upstream scale up and strengthen their infrastructure as the whole market expands. So some farms have grain tanks. Some need more of them in order to separate by variety or grow a greater diversity of things. Some of them will be better off if they also have cleaning capacity so that they can differentiate on value whether or not something's going to the malting market, which would be the highest grade, malting and seed grade, then food, then feed, then other uses. So if they can do that through cleaning capacity on the farm, they can get the highest value for their crops. So we're trying to help find funding through our nonprofit to keep fueling that infrastructure need.
Going to be the middleman. Be the middleman in this whole thing. How can we connect this person with that person? And I think, see, you've got the group here already. You have the different people all in the same room already. And if you can connect that, then somebody can say, oh, wait a second, I met the guy at that conference who does that kind of stuff. And then maybe you don't know it, but you know a baker somewhere else who needs to be connected with that person. And that's how these events are really helpful to this community.
I keep thinking about the nitty-gritty of the infrastructure, just like a cleaning facility or the small-scale equipment for the farms. And I wonder, are there things you realize if you'd known 10 years ago? Is there something, like, were there these equipment maybe was in a barn and now it's gone? Or is there anything that you wish you'd known 10 years ago, looking back?
Gosh, I've learned so much in the life. Well, when we started our mill, honestly, I was focused on freshly milled flour on stones for bakers. And we did get set up with dehulling machinery, but I had no idea the interest in oats, for example, until we started our mill. And then the backlog of oat orders would keep people waiting and waiting and waiting. And it made sense to me once we were in the flow of the business that oats grow really well in a northeastern climate with cool, moist temperatures. Farmers love to grow them, and they're pretty easy, little easier to meet food grade specs than wheat. And we live in a cold climate, so everybody starts eating oatmeal and granola in September. And it's a less scary grain when it comes to incorporating a locally sourced grain. So I call oats our gateway grain because we understand oatmeal, we understand granola, and I understand crisp topping for desserts. So you can get a college or a university to start using those, and then it opens the door to start talking about other ways they could be displacing non-local products. And so we really got into business and then spent a couple of years raising money and scaling up our oat line quite a bit. So I wish I'd known a bit more about the current efficient, dehulling technologies then, because we started with used equipment just to get ourselves started. So we got started and we're growing, but you learn some of those things along the way for sure.
That equipment and that knowledge is in a lot of ways gone. There's the people that used to do that, it's like almost a generation ago, And so you hear all the time, oh, my father, we used to grow wheat back in the 60s. And he says, I just found some. He says, it's still in the barn. And he brought it to me. And of course, I tried to sprout it and it was long gone. And I said, well, what was it called? He had no idea, And so, so there's just this little generation jump that's happened that separated us from kind of our fathers from, you know, that World War II and post World War II group, that we've lost that knowledge, and we've lost that equipment, and it's just getting that stuff back again, you know. And it isn't still in some old barns, you know. So people are always looking at it, trying to repurpose this older stuff that's really kind of farm scale, you know, that's still around, but, you know, a lot of times it's in antique shops and it's acting as a sculpture in someone's house, you know. So I think it's being able to share the knowledge with each other too. That's what's really important, and that's the great thing about this group and the Kneading Conference. And you know, I went to a conference like this in Colorado in January, the Seed School that they have out there in Colorado that they've had for 4 or 5 years. They have one. There's one in Arizona. There's one like in Washington State, although I hear that they're not going to have theirs this year, you know. But a lot of those are all affiliated with universities, you know. And that's the other thing about these nonprofits, these groups, what's holding it together? You know, if it's being held together by some corporation, and I say that as the same as a university, you know, what happens if the funding goes away or the political will for that goes away? And also what drives a lot of these things is that one personality that is got everybody together. How do you survive when that one personality is gone? And that's a real big thing. When Amber decided she was going to have to step out of her role as the executive director of the Maine Grain Alliance because her private business became, you know, so demanded so much of her time, we were really worried. And we interviewed a lot of people, and we were pretty depressed because we said, what are we going to do? What's going to hold, you know? And so you've got to have a structure that can survive the absence of that personality. So if I can give any advice to anybody that's thinking about trying to form some organization, you need to have all these different people from different areas, different expertise, and that's what's going to keep it going, you know.
I'm curious about the communication level. You obviously do a great job with the public outreach. But there's all this information that needs to be shared. There's possibly someone with some old equipment. There's someone with some seed. There's a need to get it into the ground. Do you have a central hub? Like, how do you share that information?
I'll take that one just in that, you know, most people will find your website, and then whatever info email is on the website, that's the receiving end of inquiries, and then often we're punting out to a member of the board that handles a particular issue. So that's one way. But one thing that we have faced is, well, everybody wants a strong effort like this. So in the early years, we were asked if we would franchise the conference. Could we host one in England? Could we host one in California? And it led our group of grassroots organizers that, you know, really formed around the kitchen table to say, is that the business we're in? Are we in the business of franchising grain conferences, franchising mills around the world? No. Our mission is that y'all will figure that out in your regional areas, and we hope to help facilitate conversations, show a model, show one way that it's being done in hopes that you will go home and organize, which is how it is now coming about. Richard probably fields the most questions from everybody with a fallow field within 100 miles of us saying, oh, I have a field and it's in hay and I'd love for you to grow grain on it. And, you know, that presents some challenges. Sometimes we can say, great, yeah, we'll work with you. Sometimes there isn't the money or capacity to travel and go do those things. So
they'll say, we just bought this place. It's got a whole bunch of hay fields. We don't have any equipment, so we want to do no-till. It's like, oh, okay, we'll just go throw the ground out and then, you know, start baking bread, you know? But and that is one of the things that these groups can do, too, is education, because the level of misinformation is absolutely phenomenal. I got the thing that you know about what's the difference between heirloom and heritage and landrace, and you wouldn't believe the stuff that comes out of people's mouths about what something means. I'm not eating any modern wheat because it's all GMO contaminated with glyphosate. And it's like, what can you say? You know, it's like, and you hear it all the time, you know? And so just talking to somebody about, you know, well, modern wheats have been around for 6,000 years. You know, what do you mean by modern? You know, and they think that because you've created, you know, what farmers do all the time, what they've done for millennia is look and say, look how that one's different. I like that one. Let me grow that one. Let me get that one. And that's not, well, in a way, that is genetic engineering, right? It is a farmer who has like picked that and has engineered it into something else. But people have these incredible ideas about stuff that you just have to kind of like nod your head and then try to tell them what you know about it, you know?
I would just add on to the communication piece, you know, a piece of advice just to remain open, to keep engaging with that whom you think you don't share the same ideas. So we've been mindful in the conference to welcome in the other perspective, because you can learn a lot. And I eventually realized in running a certified organic mill that all of the really great organic grain growers in the Northeast region that we were learning from and putting on our panels in our conference, they used to be conventional growers. And they all had a different story about what brought them to organics. So, you know, the one guy's arm goes numb after he applies pesticides and he decides that's it for me. Or the next guy watched his parents die of cancers that he thought were related to the pesticides they applied on their farm, so he was done. The next guy just got sick of growing conventional potatoes that nobody would buy. And so, you know, if I'm a good farmer, I'm going to grow what people want, and they're asking me for organic grains, so I'm going to grow them. I have nothing against conventional growing, but I'm going to grow what the market wants. So he was done. So if you start to realize we're all in this soup together, and the folks we lean on right now to supply the organic grains in our system didn't used to do it this way, I ended up in that course in Kansas, hiring the associate director of the program to come out and consult to help set up our mill, because his primary job was to understand how to set up mills and help Cargill and Ardent and places like that be successful all over the world. So I figured, well, he's got technical grain knowledge. He's going to help me with what piece of equipment is going to get that weed seed out, and how do I not blow up a facility and keep employees safe, right? He can teach me that. I don't need him to talk to me about, you know, organics or conventional. I need help with that. And then when you form a connection with people like that, you realize that he understands what we're doing. He's the 5th generation wheat farmer in his family that has watched their 3,000 acres in Kansas support fewer and fewer members of the family. Like, he gets that we're consolidating in a way that's not good for families if they want to farm. So he's an ally. And we're by no means on the same page when it comes to talking about pesticide use or some scale of farms. I think he's left Kansas now, and now he works for the U.S. Wheat Commission, promoting the export of U.S. wheat. You know, we're not aligned in that sense, but we brought him to the kneading conference one year, and we said, are you willing to give your perspective on the wheat industry in this country? And people might throw rotten apples at you. Is that okay? And he was game, and he did, and it just resulted in such great conversations. So be open.
I think it'd be a good moment to turn it over to questions. I have definitely more of my own, but if anyone wants to come up to the mic and ask, this would be a good moment.
So you guys are talking a lot about equipment issues for your small-scale farmers, new growers, sizing the equipment appropriately, that sort of thing. So whenever you do have these young farmers or people who are interested in putting cereal grains in, where do you go to recommend them about sourcing the equipment, which can be one of the biggest financial obstacles? That's one of the big obstacles we find with our new farmers in Vermont, and trying to figure out how to collaborate, share equipment, where to recognize, like how they can source it, where to find the funding for it. And so I'm just wondering where you guys send these new farmers. As you had mentioned, so many people do have those equipment issues. And so I was wondering where you direct people.
I can rattle off a few resources. You know, looking at what are what are people currently doing? So we have some very savvy farmers that are either mechanics and they're finding old pieces of equipment that they're fixing up themselves and making them work. We have some farmers in Maine that are traveling out west to auctions and bringing things back to Maine. We have a soil scientist and small-scale breeder who has spent a lot of time in Asia studying the small crop implements that are useful on very small plots. And he is working with philanthropists and us, the Maine Grain Alliance right now, to purchase in small-scale equipment like that to make it available in Maine. And so that would be a first-time opportunity because, as you know, in Vermont, the geography and the farm sizes are just so different from the Midwest. So we are not, it's not easy to have these great big combines that run on GPS technology now and just they go and go and go forever. Our farm sizes are much smaller, they're hillier, you need to be able to get in and out of gates. And so you just need smaller things. And often the university plot combines and whatnot are the perfect size and they're quite a bit more expensive to purchase. So sometimes you can find university programs that have done away with a small grains program that have excess equipment. When we started the mill, we scooped up some equipment from a farmer in Rhode Island who had scooped it up when URI did away with their small grains program. So just talking in your network, you start to know who's got what tucked away in a barn somewhere that might be useful.
Are you finding people collaborating and forming like equipment cooperatives to share equipment if the funding isn't available for these starting up farms?
Yep, we're seeing it happen organically with some farmers who can transport a gravity table a few miles away on a trailer for the seasonal use of it. The Maine Grain Alliance is playing a role right now, finally. It's taken a lot of years, but convincing a governmental body in Maine called the Maine Technology Institute, we have finally convinced them that even though these are not new technologies, the way in which they're being used and the collaboration at play in order to use small-scale equipment is a new development, and so it's worth funding. And so we are writing a substantial grant right now which would allow us to purchase that, and it would flow through to farms. I would say the other resource in the U.S., and I'm not sure if you have this here, is a book that came out 10 or 15 years ago called Slow Money, a play on slow food, basically talks about the use of finance as a tool to fuel farm and food operations patiently. So it's not Slow Money is not a bank, but it's another kind of network that's forming in our regions where philanthropists, business folks, banks are all trying to figure out how to mobilize capital to farm and food operations in a patient way that restores the land and the soil and food systems. So Slow Money in Maine and in the U.S. has been a really influential body in Maine, moving capital to these kinds of enterprises and moving money into the grain system.
Cool, thanks.
Our friend Sean O'Donnell says that, is this thing going? He says that his wife will come out in the middle of the night and see him on the computer, and she'll go, "Oh no, tractor porn." And that's what he's doing. He's woken up in the middle of the night, and he goes out and gets on and starts looking at equipment for sale on the internet, on Craigslist, and he knows all the places where they are. So there is a guy around here who knows in each group, in each area, who probably knows where every piece of equipment is in around, and that's the way Sean is in Maine. He said to me one time, "Oh, there's a great potato picker down on it," and I realized it was like 2 miles from my house, and he knew about it. It was in a barn somewhere. How do they know this stuff?
But this is the same farmer who's getting SARE grant money to build 1-ton grain tanks and dryers out of pieces of culvert. So the other thing I would say is start with an asset-based frame of mind and figure out what you do have in your community. So we're a shoe shop community and a paper mill industry community. So we've got technicians all around the community that can diagnose equipment problems by sound using scopes. We've got people who can fashion novel tools for the Elliott Colemans of the world. So those machine shops are around you. They can build you stuff, You just figure out what it's going to take to solve your small scale needs, and then start
and they love that idea too. I need to do something like this. You get one of those engineer types one of those, fabricators hooked into something, and boy, they'll all of a sudden they're on with you. And there are Facebook pages. You go into your Facebook thing and type in farm equipment, and you'll be amazed at the number of sites there are of people that are selling farm equipment or local buy and sell pages in your community. And the stuff's out there. You just don't know it. I go on there all the time and go, let's see. I wonder if anybody's got go down the list, and there's all these little tractors for sale and pieces of equipment. Somebody that had some money and bought a Kubota tractor like 10 years ago, and it's got 350 hours on it because they actually never did anything with it. And you can pick things up, but it's around, but you just have to go searching for it.
I think we're out of time, but I wanted to thank you guys for taking us from the gateway grain to tractor porn. That was amazing. Really inspiring. Thank you.